Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to be reviewing my experience at the Tunnel Marathon and the psychological tools and principles that I used to get a Boston Marathon qualifying time. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Tunnel Marathon is a marathon that takes place in Washington State. And one of the unique aspects of this marathon is that it's a gradual 2% downhill grade the whole way, which makes it a popular race for people who want to try and get a Boston qualifying time. The other really unique aspect of this marathon is that the first 5 kilometers of the race go through this massive old railway tunnel through the side of a mountain, which is a really cool experience as you're going through it. So, on the morning of the marathon, I got to the starting area about an hour before the race started, even though this is one of those races where you could show up about 15 minutes before the start time and that would be fine. But this leads me to psychological principle one, which is planning well, being organized, and being early helps reduce all sorts of stress and anxiety. The night before the race, as I usually do, I laid out everything I was going to wear on the floor of the hotel room, making sure I didn't forget anything. And so when I woke up that morning, I just had to put on everything I'd laid out, and I didn't have to try and remember or think about anything else. Getting to the starting area an hour ahead of time meant that I had plenty of time to find exactly where it was that I needed to be, find the start area, and take some time to relax, enjoy the scenery, and visualize my way through any pre-race jitters. And the nice thing about the starting area for the Tunnel Marathon is that it's up in the mountains, so it's beautiful to just look around and take in some of the scenery as a way of grounding yourself and managing some of that pre-race anxiety that's inevitable. Now, there wasn't a lot of pomp and circumstance at the start of the race. The organizer made some announcements over the PA, which I couldn't really hear, and then before I knew it, the people in front of me had started moving, and I was on my way. And once I crossed the starting line, I pressed the start button on my Garmin watch, and that was when I realized I'd forgotten something absolutely critical. You see, I like to approach running marathons in a very methodical, planned out way. And one of the really cool features of my Garmin watch is something called Pace Pro. And what this does is that it allows me to input a map of the race course, input the time that I'm aiming for in the marathon, and then it automatically generates the time splits that I need to make for each kilometer in order to achieve that final time. And during the marathon, all of this information shows up on my watch so that if I just follow the plan that's outlined on the watch and hit the paces each kilometer, that will give me the best chance of getting the time that I wanted. But the problem was, despite getting to the starting area an hour in advance, taking time to do all the visualization, making sure I was relaxed prior to the start, the one thing I forgot was to start the Pace Pro on my watch. And I realized this 5 seconds into the marathon. And that leads to psychological principle 2, which is despite all of your best efforts, problems will still happen because problems are a part of life. I had planned out everything, or so I thought, but I'd forgotten this one really important thing to do. And in the first 5 seconds of the marathon, I started to think to myself, you blew it. And almost instantly, some of the negative thinking and catastrophic thoughts started coming into my mind right away. Without knowing my paces, I'm either going to run too fast and blow up by the end of the marathon, or I'm going to run too slow and mess up that way. I instantly thought to myself, I'm running blind. And thus, psychological principle 3, you don't have to plan for every potential problem that might arise because you have problem-solving skills for a reason, and you can problem-solve problems when they come up. So here I was, literally in the first minute of the marathon, and I found myself having to problem-solve. The fortunate thing for me was that I knew that the marathon had a gradual descent for almost the entirety of the course, and so I didn't need to worry about altering my paces, going up hills or going down hills. I knew that given that it was a similar grade for the entire marathon, I could just focus on running at a consistent pace that wouldn't be affected by hilly terrain on the course because there wasn't any. And so a couple of minutes into the marathon, I had my little freak out about running the marathon blind, but then I was able to problem solve and figure out how I could run the marathon, try to stick to my goal time, and not blow up by the end. So once that problem was solved, I was able to settle down mentally and get back into thinking about the race. So about 3 or 4 minutes into the race, you find yourself entering the tunnel, and it's hard to overstate how cool this is. The opening is massive, and it's through the side of this mountain, and when you enter the tunnel, it's pitch black, except for lights from the headlamps of the runners that they're wearing. So while I was running through the tunnel, I did my best to try and take it in and enjoy this really cool, unique experience. And as we were running through the tunnel, I started to notice that some of the people in front of me were pointing downwards at various times, and every once in a while someone would yell out, "Puddle." And it took me a little while to clue in as to what people were doing. By pointing downwards and yelling "Puddle," the other runners were signaling to the people behind them to watch out for little potholes or puddles so that they wouldn't step in a pothole and twist their ankle or step in a puddle. And I caught myself thinking how cool it was that people were doing this for other runners who technically they were competing against. Although I don't think that most people who run marathons view the people around them as competitors. But this brings me to psychological principle 4, which is kindness and pro-social behavior is contagious. Once I realized what people were doing in terms of pointing to and identifying potential hazards in the tunnel, I began doing it as well. And the thing is, it wasn't a big deal to do, but it just felt good to be able to do something to potentially help someone behind me. Like we were all in it together, supporting one another. So once we exited the tunnel, it was about kilometer 5 or 6, and you open up onto this gravel trail in this gorgeous mountain environment. The scenery is incredible, but the main thing that I noticed once I got out of the tunnel was the change in temperature. You see, inside the tunnel, the air was really cool, probably around 13 or 14 degrees Celsius. But once I exited the tunnel, it was like you were hit with this wall of hot air because it was probably around 20 degrees Celsius that morning, which may not seem very warm, but when you're running a marathon, that temperature becomes really uncomfortable really quickly. So at this point, I was a little over 20 minutes into the marathon, and I began starting to get nervous about the heat. I'd never run a marathon at that temperature, and I knew that if it was that hot, I was unlikely to be able to run the time that I wanted to run. And I started to think about all of the potential what ifs, even though I was feeling fine and it was still really early into the race. Which leads us to psychological principle 5. Uncertainty can lead to worry because it can cause a person to begin imagining all of the potential worst-case scenarios. But I made sure that I didn't let the what-ifs spiral too long. I mean, it was probably a matter of 30 seconds before I was able to catch some of that negative catastrophic thinking and to remind myself that it was still early, my goal time was not realistic, and that the downhill nature of the course was in my favor, and that could potentially make up for any temperature issues. So at that point, I just kind of locked in between kilometers 5 and 15, where the gradual descent of the course really started. Now, the thing is, when I talk about a descent, I'm not talking about a steep hill at all. It just feels like you're having a really good day. It feels pretty easy on the course. You don't really feel the downhill too much at this point because it just feels like you're able to run a little faster, a little easier. And that's where this race became really exciting for me, as I was starting to experience the downhill nature of the course, and it wasn't feeling hard or like work to run, and I was feeling really good and really strong. And it was at that point that I really had to remind myself to hold back, which is psychological principle number 6. Don't believe everything you feel. The marathon is a very long race, and you have to approach it as such. One of the best pieces of advice that I've ever heard was that you run the first 10 miles of a marathon using your head. And what that means is to make sure that you control that enthusiasm and energy that you have at the start of a marathon. I was feeling really good and really strong, and the kilometers were coming very easy between 5 and 15. And there was a temptation to pick it up. Maybe I could run an even faster time than I had planned. Just because it felt easy, just because it felt good, it was still important to follow what I knew rationally, which was that there was a lot of race to go, and that if I needed to pace myself rather than following how I felt and getting caught up in the enthusiasm of it and likely hitting a wall and blowing up in the last 10 to 15 kilometers. And so I was holding back and running slightly below my target pace for the first 15 or 16 kilometers or so. And then around kilometer 17 or 18, I started to hit the target pace for my kilometers. Now, if the first 10 miles of a marathon are run with your head, the second 10 miles of a marathon are run with your training. So it was almost like I put myself into autopilot, relying on my training and just clicking away at the kilometers, trying to be as on pace as possible. And for the most part, I was doing fine between kilometers 20 and 30. And it was at this point of the marathon that I used psychological principle number 7, which is to know when to focus on what's going on in your body versus focusing on outside of your body. And I was alternating between the two. There were times where I just focused on the amazing scenery around me, getting outside of my body and the tension and fatigue that I was starting to feel. Really trying to take in what it was like to run across these amazing trestle bridges, seeing waterfalls and eagles flying overhead. It was really cool and such a remarkable distraction to prevent myself from getting too caught up in whether or not my legs were starting to get too tired. But at other times, I began to focus on what was going on inside of me, really focusing on trying to have a steady rhythm for my breathing, paying attention to my arm swing, thinking about picking up my feet, and trying to focus on good running form. The alternating back and forth between these was a really helpful distraction between kilometers 20 and 30. But around kilometer 31 or 32, things began to start falling apart. And if you've ever run a marathon, you know that it's around this point in marathon that things become really hard. The grade and the descent of the course wasn't changing, the beauty of the scenery wasn't changing, but I was struggling to hit my paces, and then I noticed that the kilometers were taking 5 or 10 seconds longer than they should. And it was around this point that I realized that the downhill of the course wasn't going to be enough to make up for the impact of the heat. And what I was concerned about around kilometers 5 or 6 was starting to happen. I wasn't in any pain, my legs weren't hurting, my knees weren't hurting, my back wasn't hurting, but it was just getting harder and harder to keep my legs going at the speed I needed them to go. And I started to get discouraged and frustrated and upset because this was the marathon course that should have guaranteed me a Boston Marathon qualifying time. But it felt like it was slipping away because of the temperature, and I started getting upset because it wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that I had to run this marathon course on such a hot day. Which brings me to psychological principle number 8, which is no one ever said that life was fair and the marathon owes me nothing. One of the most common faulty beliefs and assumptions that people will hold is this notion that life is fair. And while it can be comforting to think something like that, the problem is that when things go wrong, if you believe that life is fair, then it must mean that you did something to deserve the negative thing that's happening. The reality is life isn't fair, and sometimes things just don't go your way, and it's not necessarily your fault or anyone else's fault. It just happens. A marathon is a difficult race. There's no two ways about it. It's too long of a race for things to not go wrong. Sometimes you get great weather, and sometimes you get terrible weather. And I just happened to find myself running a marathon on a day that was hotter than I wanted it to be. And so I began repeating to myself that the marathon doesn't owe me anything. And I was able to get out of that frustration and upset and just get back to focusing on my running form and trying to get every little bit of energy out of my legs. So if the first 10 miles of the marathon is run with your head, and the next 10 miles of the marathon is run with your training, the last 10 kilometers of the marathon is run with your heart. At least that's how it felt for me in kilometers 33 to 42. My legs were so exhausted. It felt like I had nothing left, and everything in my being wanted to stop and walk because I felt like I just could not go on. And even though I was pushing myself, it was taking me longer and longer to finish each kilometer. And I recognized that there was no way that I was going to be able to finish in my target time. Brings me to psychological principle number 9, which is when you fail to achieve a goal, it doesn't mean that you can't achieve a different goal. We often think of success and failure as binary. Either you succeed 100% or you fail. I recognized that I wasn't going to succeed at the goal that I had planned, but I remember saying to myself out loud at one point in those last few kilometers, don't give up. It was around that point in the marathon that my goal shifted away from any particular time to just pushing myself to step every step with as much energy as I had. And eventually, I rounded this corner and saw the finish line. The end of this race is fantastic in that you can see the finish line from about 200 or 300 miles away, and the signs are lined with spectators and people cheering you on. And so I emptied the tank. I sprinted as fast as I could, and in my mind, I was flying. But in the video that my wife recorded, it looks like I'm barely moving. But at that point, it was just about getting to that finish line. My goal going into the race was to finish in 3 hours, 11 minutes, and 30 seconds, and my actual finish time was 3 hours, 17 minutes, and 25 seconds. So I was almost 6 minutes slower than I had planned, but despite that, I still felt really good about what I had accomplished. And that brings us to psychological principle number 10. Don't judge what you accomplish based on your expectations, but judge what you accomplish based on what actually happened. I didn't fail to achieve my goal time because I didn't run a good race. I failed to achieve my goal time because the goal was based on an assumption that the temperature was going to be 5 or 6 degrees cooler than it actually was. That assumption was wrong. So if there was any failure, it was in the failure to have predicted the temperature and weather that day, not the failure in how I ran the race. And even with everything that didn't go the way I expected it to, I still completed a marathon, which is an amazing achievement. And not only that, I ran a marathon in a Boston qualifying time. And regardless of whether or not that time is good enough to get me into Boston, it doesn't matter. It was still a really cool experience. So I hope that if you ever find yourself running a marathon, some of the psychological principles I've talked about today will help you get to that finish line feeling good about what you've accomplished. And if you want to learn more about negative thinking patterns that can hold you back from accomplishing big things in your life, I'd encourage you to check out this video. So that's all for today's video. As always, thank you for making it all the way to the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one.